For a long time me and my wives lived peacefully in our little cabin and I took care of our children like a good father should, and that's when I also decided to protect another young girl named Katie. I knew about her from the other I Spit on Your Grave movie, so I decided to help protect her. So one day I asked my wives to move to New York City for a little job I now had as a former mixed martial artist, and we stayed in the same apartment building as Katie, and I actually lived across from Katie, and I made sure that no one hurts her. So when that douchebag Georgie showed up I decided to confront his dumbass and I said, dude, you better leave or I'm calling the cops right now. And then I dialed 911 and the cops answered and I said, yes, hello dispatch, there's a suspicious person in my apartment building. And then I told them my address and Georgie ran off, and I walked over and I knocked on Katie's door and I said, hello Katie, some guy with long curly hair tried to get in your door and he said his name is Georgie. And then she said, oh my god, that guy is a creep, will you please spend a night with me? And then I said, ma'am, I'm married. And then she said, I didn't mean it like that. And then I said, well, I suppose I could spend a night with you, but no funny business. And she looked at me and smiled like a pervert and she said, okay, no funny business. And then I asked her, do you have a couch or something like that? And then she said, yes, but it's uncomfortable. And I said, it's fine, I can just sleep on the couch. And I slept on Katie's couch and that made Katie like me a lot for some reason. And then I said, you know, I can help you, I've got connections and I was a famous MMA fighter, so I can help you and don't worry, I will help you for free, Katie. And then she ran up and kissed me and I said, no, I am married, please stop that. And then she said, I'm sorry. And then she smiled at me like a pervert and then I said, why are you looking at me like that? And then I said, I have to go. And then she jumped in front of me and she said, wait please. And then I said, move please ma'am. And then Katie said, no, stay here, I wanted to cook you something to eat because you're a big muscular man and I'm sure you eat a lot of food every day and I want to help you out. And I said, ma'am, I'm married. And she said, I know that already but I don't care. And then I said, I have to go, Katie. And then I said, I was just trying to protect you, that's all. And then Katie came to my door and my beautiful naked wife Natasha answered the door and she said, oh, it's you, our neighbor Katie, how nice to meet you dear, so you met my very handsome husband. Did he protect you from those bad men? And then I said, Natasha, behave and please honey put some clothes on. And then Katie said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have came over here. And then Natasha said, it's okay, you just caught us in awkward situation, I was just having sex with my beautiful husband and I was fucking his brains out, as I'm sure you probably want to do, huh, Stingbean. And then Katie said, fuck you lady. And then Natasha said, what's wrong, did I hit a nerve? And then Natasha said, you know, he really is great in a marriage and he's very good at having sex with women. And then Katie said, I have to go now, I'm sorry, please give this to Matthew. And then Natasha handed me the food and I said to Natasha, she brought me food. And then Natasha said, yes dear, she brought you something to eat and I know that poor girl definitely wants to have sex with you. And then I said, well, I'm not interested. And then Natasha asked me, really, that's fascinating because she's single and you saved her life, I'm sure, and there's something that has always bothered me about you Matthew, because I know you don't seem entirely human. And I laughed really loud and I said, I am human Natasha, I'm just a very strong and capable human, that is all. And then she asked me, how is it that I've never seen you injured and I have never seen you bruise, hell, you don't even get sick, so you know what I think. And then I asked, what Natasha? And then she said, I think you're not human. And then I said, wrong, I am human, I'm just not an ordinary human. And then she said, see, you keep saying things like that to me and it makes me suspicious, you're not really confirming or denying anything, you're really just neutral on the whole situation, but eventually you will have to pick a side, right or wrong. And then I said, fine, I'm superhuman Natasha and I have superpowers, there you go, you happy now because you have your answer.